Hygiene, Public Health, and the Social Body. I am Sean Tackett, and I am delighted to introduce our panelists today. First up is Rudy Le Menthéour, who is assistant professor in the French department at Bryn Mawr. He's the author of numerous books, including a forthcoming edited edition that I'm looking forward to, one of the key medical texts that he's going to discuss today. His talk is titled, "I Am Not a Number, From Repopulation to Regeneration in 18th Century France."
Okay, so usually people say, excuse my French, and I will just say, excuse my English. So the sense of decay and the urge to improve national standings that emerged in 18th century France have been very well studied by historians, I think mainly of Sean Quinlan and The Great Nation in Decline. In this context, the fight against depopulation and the condemnation of degeneration have usually been considered as very closely related, or even as two sides, two ways of addressing the same phenomenon. In other words, at first view, decline was approached in the guise of depopulation by political arithmetic or political economy, whereas physicians and especially hygienists conceived of national decline mainly as a form of physical degeneration. Well, I argue that instead of rushing to merge these two sets of preoccupation, so degeneration and depopulation, we should first make a more clear-cut distinction between them. Discourses on depopulation and on degeneration were obviously linked, but it doesn't mean they were equivalent. Seeing them as distinct discourses would allow us to better analyze the ways they combined and how they were later merged in a single political ideology. So regeneration and repopulation being conceived as one single task or goal. Okay, so probably you will have the feeling that I'm reinventing the fil à couper de beurre, as we say in French. But this is only a preliminary inquiry, and within the constraints of this short talk, I will focus on the distinction between depopulation and degeneration and try to show why it is interesting to reconceptualize this link. So first, as I am a literary scholar, I will look at the definitions. And if you look at the definitions closely in the 18th century, it looks like population itself was still considered as a neologism in the 18th century. The word appears only in the 5th edition of the Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française in 1798. Now, if you open the encyclopedia, you have an entry, population, and we read this definition by Damy Laville. Population designates the relationship between men and the territory they occupy in the direct ratio of their number and the inverse ratio of space. So population was defined in a probably more sophisticated way than now, because if you look at the Random House dictionary that happens to be in my office, it is defined as the total number of persons inhabiting a country, city, or any district or area. So it is a sum and not a ratio. And it looks like what Damy Laville was referring to would be named density of population and not population per se. Damy Laville's definition was clearly the prevailing one in the 18th century, or in the second half of the 18th century. But in treatises in favor of population, like L'Ami des Hommes, the Marquis de Mirabeau the Elder, defines population differently, as the multiplication of men. Population, according to him, is considered neither as a sum nor as a ratio, but as a principle or source of wealth alongside agriculture. So I will make two brief comments. First, according to these definitions, the term repopulation doesn't make much sense and would seem redundant. So the symmetry depopulation, repopulation, and degeneration, regeneration is not totally accurate. Secondly, both Damilaville and Mirabeau define population in numerical terms in compliance with the new paradigm of political arithmetic, a discipline, as you know, that was established by William Petty in 17th century England and that inspired 18th century French political economy. So at the risk of simplifying such an approach, I would say that political arithmetic considers it possible to quantify human society and thus solve its economical issues as a mathematical problem. At the other end of the spectrum, some writers do not define population in quantitative terms, but rather according to its specific quality. So, for instance, if you consider Gabriel de Bory's definition, it appears clearly. So, Gabriel de Bory was a former governor of Saint-Domingue, and in one of his essays published in 1789, he says, quote, "By population, I mean the gathering of all the different conditions that, as they go, so to speak, by imperceptible nuances from the most elevated subjects to those pursuing the vilest professions, compose a body whose whole parts sustain each other's." So it looks like in the colonial context, shaping a population implied relying on what William Max Nelson in his very good article named racial engineering, in order to craft, and the aim was to craft a hierarchical yet unified society. So my point is that according to this new definition, population does not designate an object of mathematical analysis, but a political goal based on a concept directly borrowed to Buffon's natural history, namely degeneration. I think this example shows how important it is not to take for granted words like population that seem simple at first sight. Thanks to their plasticity, neologisms can be attributed new meanings and can be used by very different discourses or paradigms. The problem is when a neologism succeeds too well, it becomes difficult for the historian to grasp the intertwining of discourses that framed its definition when it first emerged. I also hope that this example shows that when we talk about population, degeneration, and regeneration, it becomes essential to distinguish between the main discursive types, in this case, political economy, medical discourse or hygiene, and natural history, because they coincide with different sets of priorities that can potentially conflict with each other's. So let's look at what happens when degeneration is at the foreground. As you know, Buffon's monumental Histoire naturelle, so published from 1749 and 1767, at least the first chunk of it, was instrumental in changing the terms of the debate on national decline. For sure, depopulation remained a central concern afterwards. But Buffon fostered a mindset that prioritized degeneration over depopulation. In the 6th volume, published in 1756, I look at all the dates because I know you're a historian, so I was very cautious. Within the article on the hair, it took an original stance in the debate on depopulation. He claimed that there was neither a growth or a decline of the human species, globally speaking. Quote, "For taking all the inhabitants of the globe together, the number of the human race, like that of other animals, will at all times appear to be nearly the same, as this depends entirely upon a balance of physical causes, a balance to which everything has long been reduced, on which neither the efforts of man nor any moral circumstances whatever can dissolve, as those circumstances themselves are also dependent on physical causes." So it's a very elaborated way of saying that even though the distribution of human population will vary, of course, and even though the numbers may change, locally speaking, the global human population is stationary according to Buffon. Whatever changes we establish in our moral or political systems. This statement was not at all incompatible with a strong populationist policy. For instance, if you look again at the article population in the encyclopedia, so the article dates from 1765, it looks like Damy Laville shared Buffon's views while promoting political measures in favor of population. So it was not at all incompatible. But in Buffon's work, it seems that this treatment of the depopulation problem allows the naturalist to shift attention from depopulation to degeneration and to advocate not so much repopulation as the physical regeneration of the human species. Before I proceed with his conceptions on regeneration, I should perhaps remind you what Buffon meant by species. According to Buffon, in interfertility, that is the fact when you have two individuals mating and when the progeny is also fertile, that's what he calls interfertility. That's the only scientific criterion to establish that two individuals belong to the same species. And it led Rousseau to some weird consequences in his second discourse. He explained, Buffon explained the continuity of species over time thanks to his theory of the organic mold, a force that shaped the organic matter during the conception. And according to Buffon, this mold, this organic mold, naturally degenerates under the influence of external causes such as food, climate, etc. But according to Buffon, this natural degeneration caused by external factors can be countered by monitoring reproduction. And of course, in order to establish this possibility, you need first to establish a theory of heredity that takes into account both lineage, the female and the male semens, as he called them. So, thanks to this theory of species, of fertility, of heredity, Buffon is able to celebrate the way horse breeders have been perfecting horse species by mating different individuals. So in his famous article on the horse, published in 1753, he says that horse breeders artificially regenerate the species of the horse by mating different horse races or varieties. The vocabulary is kind of flexible. It takes advantage of this eulogy to establish a universal rule for the enhancement of species. So, and I quote Buffon, the model of what is handsome and excellent is dispersed through all parts of the earth, and in each climate there is a portion thereof which perpetually degenerates unless united with another portion taken from a distant country. To have fine horses, dogs, etc., it is proper for the males and females to be of different countries. So you should take the individuals from the most distant parts, that are the most different, to regenerate the species and go back to the purity of the prototype. So the purity of the prototype is actually achieved by crossing diverse individuals, which is kind of a paradoxical idea. So whereas Buffon was prudently allusive, according to the, concerning the possible application of this theory to other species, Charles-Augustin van der Monde is far more explicit in his essay sur la manière de perfectionner l'espèce humaine, published in 1756. In this treatise on hygiene, it mainly deals with hygiene for pregnant women, and it also deals with child rearing and education more generally. Van der Monde, who's a physician, clearly advocates enhancing the human species by relying on the breeder's techniques described by Buffon. That is, by resorting to race crossing. Of course, race is, at that time, is still conceived in a very loose way. So you could say also variety crossing. I argue that, so in the scholarly edition I just finished, I argue that Van der Monde invented modern eugenics more than 1 century before the term was crafted by Galton in 1883 by applying Buffon's theory to the human species. But the careful selection of future partners advocated by Van der Monde is only one aspect of a more general program of physical regeneration that also relies on traditional lifestyle advices. So Van der Monde's essay is very representative of the tendency amongst hygienists to neglect depopulation by focusing on degeneration and regeneration. And this Buffonian shift, if we may call it that way, is also obvious in the colonial context. But I want to elaborate on this topic because Max Nelson, in his great article, already showed how administrators like Gabriel de Bory relied on Buffon's theory to advance their racial agenda. Now, it would be misleading to assert that this quest for regeneration totally replaced concerns for depopulation. So now I'm going to focus on the discourses that kept depopulation as one of the main topics of interest. In fact, there was no linear evolution going from a quantitative paradigm to a qualitative one. And we should rather distinguish between discursive types establishing different scales of priorities. One can read Van der Monde's work as hygiene and eugenics or proto-eugenics, borrowing concepts to Buffon's natural history of man. But hygiene was not necessarily the master discourse and could itself be reclaimed by a quantitative approach. So I think that one of the interesting things is that with Van der Monde's work, hygiene as a discipline is encroaching on the field of natural history and borrowing concepts from natural history. But the reverse can happen. Hygiene itself can be used by other types of discourses. And it's very interesting to see how these different discourses subsume each other's. I will just mention one example, and one example in part because I didn't have time to conduct much more research. That is Menthéour's Recherches et considérations sur la population de la France, published in 1778, and it has been attributed sometimes to Moreau and sometimes to Menthéour, but let's stick with Menthéour. There are numerous arguments about for each hypothesis. So Menthéour's Recherches et considérations is considered the foundational work in the field of demographics. So if you open that book, you will see that the first book, the first section addresses population according to a perspective that is typical of political economy. So Menthéour defines population, advocates for a policy in its favor, and details the different economic measures to be taken, etc. But then, in chapter 9, you have considerations on hate and strength, la taille et la force, that are already reminiscent of hygienic and eugenic concerns that were not new at all. More than 20 years before, van der Mont had already intended to enhance human strength, and I want to remind you the curious experiment by Friedrich. I don't know how to say that, if it's, I should say it in German, English, or French. Anyway, Frédéric Guillaume Ier, or Friedrich Wilhelm the First, King of Prussia. So an experiment consisting in enhancing grenadiers regiments' general hate. So it's usually it's referred to as the Potsdam Grenadiers experience. More interestingly, now if you look at the second book, the first part is actually entirely a treaty of hygiene per se. Chapter 1 of this second book deals with air, chapter 2 with winds, and the third chapter elaborates on water, the fourth addresses food, the fifth fatigue and rest, and chapter 6 habits, chapter 7 professions detrimental to health, and lastly chapter 8 analyzes the effects of climate and diet on affections. So there is nothing really original in the content of this second book, but it's very interesting to see that in a work that would be categorized more as belonging to political economy, you have a kind of you have a chunk of hygiene that is totally intact. In the list I just told you, you may identify 5 of the 6 non-natural causes traditionally addressed by classical hygiene. So air, food and drink, sleep and watch, exercise, rest, and passions. Well, evacuations are not mentioned here, and I'm grateful for that. But this classical presentation, okay, I'm nearly done. This classical presentation hides a new hygienic paradigm that emerged in the 18th century. There is a special focus on air and water, and a new emphasis on professional hygiene, and really emerged in the 18th century, with Tissot, for instance. More generally, this second book betrays a radical shift from personal hygiene to public hygiene in the 1770s under the influence of the Société Royale de Médecine. So my point is that in Menthéour's treatise, hygienic concerns are definitely taken into account, but they are subsumed under a quantitative approach that we would name population economics nowadays. He makes no mention of degeneration, and it appears that the main issue, according to Menthéour, remains depopulation, and that public hygiene is thus conceived as in a purely instrumental way. So Menthéour also borrows to the Histoire naturelle, but in line with his quantitative bias, he prefers Buffon's mortality tables to his theories of degeneration. So it is, how much more time do I have? None? Okay. Okay, so I will be really brief. So I think it's very interesting to look at these two different paradigms, depopulation and degeneration, because we can better analyze the scale of priorities that belong to specific writers. It is also interesting because then you can look at projects that didn't look that interesting, but see that the two paradigms converge. For instance, in the projet pour conserver l'espèce des hommes bien faits, réserver les hommes vigoureux pour la culture des terres et augmenter le nombre des soldats, a physician like Antoine Le Camus promotes a kind of discursive hybrid. So to put it quickly, Le Camus advocates having crippled, one-eyed men and hunchbacks join the French army and constitute separate regiments. And according to him, it's going to improve the national stock because these guys are going to be killed the first. Okay, so it's exactly the contrary of Friedrich Wilhelm I. So it's interesting because Le Camus is also mentioning measures to be taken that are typical of political economy, like a gradual taxation on domesticity. So you can see that he's embracing issues typical of political economy, but as a physician, and that his main concern is actually degeneration. Okay, so now I conclude with my no minute. So I think it would be interesting to pursue this inquiry on the complicated relation between population and regeneration. And one of the interesting results would be that we would probably better understand what regeneration meant in the context of the French Revolution. As you know, the debate between Mona Ozouf and David Bell has drawn our attention to this question of regeneration during the French Revolution. Was it conceived as gradual or sudden? Was that a transfer of sacrality to the political field? And was regeneration supposed to shape a new man, as Mona Ozouf argues, or a new people, as David Bell argues? Well, although this is only a preliminary research project, I suspect historians of the French Revolution would have much to gain by focusing more on the physical side of regeneration and the way it connects with Buffon's theory of degeneration. We need to evaluate the way different types of discourses or different types of discipline, like natural history, political economy, hygiene, merged or didn't merge during the emergence of such an ideology of regeneration. Such a study would allow us to go beyond the description of pure binaries, degeneration, depopulation, and would allow us to analyze more precisely the overlapping of different scales of priorities.